The teacher laughed when a black boy said his dad worked at the Pentagon. The class joined in. She called him a liar. But minutes later, the door opened and the truth walked in wearing a government badge. What happened next silenced the entire room. "So you expect us to believe your dad works at the Pentagon?" The classroom exploded with laughter. It wasn't just giggles. It was a kind of laughter that stung, sharp, careless, and loud enough to echo off the walls. Desks rattled as students leaned toward each other, covering their mouths, whispering Marcus's name like it was a joke. 12-year-old Marcus Johnson stood frozen beside his desk. His hands shook slightly at his sides. He tried to stop them, curling his fingers into his palms the way his dad had taught him when he felt nervous. But it didn't help. His cheeks burned hot, like everyone could see the embarrassment spreading across his face. Still, his eyes stayed steady. Marcus had only answered a simple question. Mrs. Reynolds had asked the class to stand one by one and say what their parents did for a living. Doctors, business owners, engineers. Some kids exaggerated, some joked. The class applauded politely every time. When it was Marcus's turn, he didn't hesitate. "My dad works at the Pentagon," he had said quietly. He hadn't smiled. He hadn't bragged. He hadn't looked around to see who was impressed. He had simply told the truth. That was when Mrs. Reynolds leaned back against her desk and smirked. "The Pentagon isn't a grocery store, Marcus," she said loudly, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "It's a highly secure government facility." She paused, letting the words sink in. "You shouldn't lie to impress your classmates." More laughter followed. Someone in the back muttered, "Yeah, right," and another student snorted so loudly it drew even more attention. Marcus felt his throat tighten. He opened his mouth just for a second, as if he might explain. As if he might say, "My dad leaves before sunrise," or "He never tells me what he works on," or "He makes me promise not to talk about it." But Marcus closed his mouth again. He had learned a long time ago that explaining the truth sometimes made things worse. Last year, when a substitute teacher asked why his dad missed every school assembly, Marcus had said, "He's on assignment." The teacher laughed and said, "Sure he is," and the whole class joined in. Another time, a classmate asked why Marcus didn't have pictures of his dad at work. When Marcus answered honestly he's not allowed to take them, the kid rolled his eyes and said, "Your dad must think he's a spy." Marcus stopped talking after that. So now, as the laughter filled the room, Marcus lowered his head slightly and stared at the floor. The scuffed tiles looked safer than the faces around him. He focused on breathing, slow in, slow out, just like his father had taught him. Across the room, Mrs. Reynolds shook her head as if disappointed. "Marcus," she continued, "there's nothing wrong with having a regular job. You don't need to make up stories." She glanced around the classroom. Honesty matters. The irony hit Marcus hard. Because he was being honest. His dad never wore flashy clothes. He didn't drive a luxury car. He didn't talk about power or rank or importance. At home, he helped with homework, fixed broken doors, and reminded Marcus to say "yes, ma'am" and "no, sir." But every morning, before the sun came up, his father put on a suit so sharp it looked like armor. And every night, when he came home, his eyes carried a tiredness Marcus didn't fully understand, but respected. Marcus swallowed. He didn't cry. He wouldn't give them that. Mrs. Reynolds clapped her hands once. "All right, class, let's move on." Just like that, the moment was dismissed, at least for everyone else. But for Marcus, it stayed. It settled heavy in his chest as he sat back down. He could feel eyes on him, some curious, some amused, some sympathetic, but none brave enough to speak up. The lesson continued, but Marcus didn't hear a word. His mind drifted to that morning, to his father kneeling by the door, fixing Marcus's loose shoelace before school. To tell the truth, his dad had said gently, "Even when people don't believe you, that's strength." Marcus wondered if strength was supposed to feel this lonely. What no one in that room knew was that Marcus's father hadn't gone straight to work that morning. He had parked his car in the school lot. He had signed in at the front office. And at that very moment, just down the hallway, David Johnson was walking toward the classroom, holding an official folder under his arm, unaware of the laughter, unaware of the humiliation, but about to change everything. Marcus wasn't the loudest kid in class. He never raised his hand just to be seen. He never tried to make people laugh or draw attention to himself. While other students talked over one another, Marcus listened. While others rushed to answer, Marcus waited, careful, thoughtful, deliberate. He didn't brag. He didn't show off. And he didn't correct adults, even when he knew they were wrong. That wasn't weakness. That was something his father had taught him early in life. Let your actions speak louder than your words, his dad always said. David Johnson didn't lecture. He lived by example. Marcus's father worked long hours. Hours Marcus didn't always understand, but deeply respected. Some mornings, Marcus would wake up to an empty kitchen, a note on the counter written in his father's neat handwriting. Proud of you. Be good. Be honest. Other nights, Marcus would already be asleep when David came home. He'd only know his dad was back because the house felt different, quieter, safer, warmer somehow. When David did come home before bedtime, he always smiled, even when his shoulders looked heavy with exhaustion. He'd ask about school, about homework, about whether Marcus had been kind that day. He never complained. He never talked about stress or pressure. And he never talked about his job. Not because he didn't want to, but because he couldn't. Marcus learned early that certain questions didn't need answers. When his friends talked about their parents' offices or uniforms or company logos, Marcus stayed quiet. He knew his father's work was important, but more than that, he knew it was private. David never wore his uniform outside. Never walked around like he wanted to be noticed. To the world, he looked like an ordinary man in a suit, calm, respectful, invisible. And he liked it that way. Sometimes, strangers would assume David was just another office worker. Other times, people guessed he was security or building management. David never corrected them. He would simply smile. And Marcus noticed. That lesson stayed with him. Real power doesn't announce itself. So when Marcus told the truth at school, he didn't expect applause. He didn't expect admiration. He didn't expect anyone to be impressed. He simply answered honestly, because that's how his father raised him. But he also didn't expect humiliation. Mrs. Reynolds shook her head slowly, disappointment etched across her face. Marcus, she said, loud enough for the entire class to hear, lying like this is disrespectful. The word lying cut deep. Marcus felt it settle in his chest, heavy and sharp. Why don't you say your father is a janitor or a security guard? She continued. Those are respectable jobs, too. The room went silent. Not the comfortable kind of silence, but the kind that presses against your ears. Desks stopped creaking. Whispers died mid-sentence. Even the air felt tense. Marcus clenched his fists under the desk. His nails pressed into his palms, grounding him. Because his father was respectable. More than anyone in that room could possibly imagine. Marcus thought of his dad standing in the doorway every night, making sure the house was locked. Of the way David corrected his posture gently, reminding him to stand tall, not out of pride, but out of self-respect. He thought of the times his father had said, "People may misunderstand you. Don't let that change who you are." Mrs. Reynolds mistook Marcus's silence for guilt. "See," she said, shaking her head again. "This is why honesty matters." Marcus wanted to speak. He wanted to say, "My dad helps protect this country." He wanted to say, "He works in places you'll never see." He wanted to say, "You're wrong." But he didn't. Because his father had taught him something else too. You don't argue with ignorance. You outgrow it. Marcus kept his head down. But inside, something shifted. Not anger. Not hatred. Just a quiet resolve. The class moved on. Mrs. Reynolds continued teaching as if nothing had happened. Some students stole glances at Marcus, unsure whether to feel sorry for him or embarrassed for themselves. Marcus stared at his notebook, the words blurring together. Because in that moment, he understood something painful but powerful. Sometimes, the truth doesn't need defending. Sometimes it just needs time. And time, whether they knew it or not, was about to run out. Because just down the hallway, behind the closed classroom door, David Johnson was being escorted by the school principal. Not as a guest. Not as a visitor. but as a representative of a federal partnership program. The man everyone assumed was just another office worker was about to step into the room. And when he did, the truth wouldn't need words at all. That same morning, just as Mrs. Reynolds turned back toward the whiteboard, the classroom door creaked open slightly. The school secretary, Mrs. Collins, stood in the doorway. Her face was tight with urgency, nothing like her usual cheerful smile. She caught Mrs. Reynolds's eye and motioned subtly. Mrs. Reynolds frowned and walked over. The two women whispered. At first, Mrs. Reynolds nodded casually. Then her posture stiffened. Her eyebrows lifted just a little, just enough for Marcus to notice. The color drained from her face, replaced by a forced, uneasy smile. She cleared her throat. "Class," she said, her voice suddenly too careful. "We have a guest speaker today. Please sit up straight." Chairs scraped against the floor as students shifted in confusion. A few kids straightened their backs. Others whispered. Marcus felt a strange tightening in his chest. The door opened wider. A tall black man stepped inside. He wore a perfectly pressed navy blue suit, sharp lines cutting cleanly across his shoulders. His shoes gleamed like they had never touched dust. But it wasn't the clothes that changed a room. It was how he carried himself. His posture was firm. His steps were measured. Every movement felt deliberate. He didn't rush. He didn't hesitate. He walked like someone used to being listened to. The chatter died instantly. Even the air seemed to still. Marcus's heart skipped. He knew that walk. He had seen it every morning at dawn, every evening when his father came home, every time David Johnson entered a room without asking for attention, yet somehow commanded it anyway. It was his father. For a split second, Marcus forgot how to breathe. David Johnson paused just inside the doorway, his eyes calmly scanning the room. He took in the rows of desks, the children watching him with wide eyes, the nervous teacher standing near the board. Then his gaze landed on Marcus. Their eyes met. Marcus straightened in his chair immediately, not because he was told to, but because that was what he had been raised to do. His shoulders pulled back. His chin lifted just slightly. David gave the smallest nod. Pride, reassurance, strength, all in a single motion. "Good morning," David said evenly, his voice deep and steady, carrying effortlessly across the room. "Thank you for having me." No microphone, no raised voice. He didn't need either. "I'm here for the district's education partnership review," he continued. Mrs. Reynolds swallowed and forced a smile. "Yes, of course," she said quickly. "And you are?" The question hung in the air. David didn't rush to answer. He reached calmly into his suit jacket and pulled out a leather wallet. He opened it carefully, turned it outward, and held it up at chest level. The badge caught the light. Bold letters. Official seal. United States Department of Defense, the Pentagon. A few students leaned forward instinctively. David's voice didn't change. "I'm Deputy Operations Director David Johnson," he said. "And Marcus Johnson is my son." The room went dead silent. No whispers. No laughter. No movement. You could hear the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Mrs. Reynolds froze. Her mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. Slowly, painfully, the realization settled in. The boy she had accused of lying, the child she had humiliated, the student she had dismissed, had been telling the truth the entire time. Students turned in their seats, staring at Marcus now, not with amusement, not with doubt, but with shock. Some looked embarrassed. Others looked awed. A few looked down at their desks, replaying the laughter in their minds. Marcus felt his chest tighten. Not with victory, with relief. David lowered his badge and slid it back into his jacket. He walked forward a few steps, stopping beside Marcus's desk. He placed one hand gently on his son's shoulder. It wasn't a dramatic gesture. It wasn't meant for the room. It was for Marcus. A quiet message. You did nothing wrong. David turned back toward Mrs. Reynolds. "I understand there was some confusion earlier today," he said calmly, "about my son's honesty." Mrs. Reynolds's hands trembled slightly as she clasped them together. "Mr. Johnson, David raised a hand gently, not to silence her, but to steady the moment. "I'm not here to embarrass anyone," he said. "I'm here because this school is part of a federal initiative to support student development and equity." He paused. "And because my son deserves the same respect as any other child in this room." No anger. No shouting. No threats. Just truth. And somehow, that made it even more powerful. Marcus sat quietly, feeling something he had never felt before in a classroom. Seen. Believed. Protected. And as David Johnson stood there, calm, composed, undeniable, every person in that room understood something they would never forget. The truth doesn't always announce itself. But when it arrives with authority. Mrs. Reynolds's face drained of color. It happened slowly, like the realization was sinking in piece by piece. The confident posture she usually carried disappeared, replaced by stiff shoulders and shallow breaths. Her eyes flicked from David Johnson's calm expression to the badge he had just put away, then to Marcus, sitting silently at his desk. David turned to her, not angry, not loud, not even disappointed in the way people expected. Just calm. The kind of calm that comes from certainty. "My son told me he was embarrassed today," David said, his voice steady but gentle. "Not because he lied, but because he told the truth and wasn't believed." The words landed softly, but they landed deep. Mrs. Reynolds's lips parted, but she didn't interrupt. David looked around the classroom slowly, deliberately. His eyes moved from desk to desk, meeting the gaze of every student, some wide-eyed, some ashamed, some frozen in place. "Children learn from how adults treat them," he continued, "especially when it comes to dignity." The room stayed silent. No one laughed. No one whispered. No one shifted in their seat. The students were staring at Marcus now, not with amusement, not with disbelief, but with something else. Respect. And beneath it, regret. A boy in the back lowered his head. A girl near the window folded her hands tightly in her lap. They remembered the laughter. They remembered the words. And for the first time, they understood the weight of them. David stepped closer to Marcus's desk and placed a firm, reassuring hand on his son's shoulder. Marcus felt the warmth immediately. "My job is classified," David said calmly. "That doesn't make my son a liar." The simplicity of the statement hit harder than any lecture. Mrs. Reynolds swallowed hard. Her throat felt tight, her chest heavy. She clasped her hands together, trying to steady herself. I apologize," she said quietly. Her voice barely carried past the first row of desks. David didn't react right away. He studied her for a brief moment, not to judge her, but to understand whether the apology was real. Then he nodded once. "Apologies matter most when they're public," he said. The words weren't sharp. They were true. Mrs. Reynolds hesitated. She looked at Marcus, then at the class, then back at David. Her face flushed, not with anger, but with shame. She turned slowly to face her students. "I was wrong," she said louder now. "Marcus told the truth, and I humiliated him." The words echoed in the room. Some students shifted uncomfortably. Others nodded slowly. A few stared at Marcus, unsure how to meet his eyes after what had happened. Marcus felt something stir in his chest. Not pride, not revenge. Relief. The kind of relief that loosens a tight knot you didn't realize you were carrying. Mrs. Reynolds took a breath and continued. "I made assumptions," she admitted. "And those assumptions hurt someone who did nothing wrong." She paused. "That will not happen again." David inclined his head slightly. "Thank you," he said. "That's how accountability begins." He turned to the class. "I want all of you to understand something," he said. "The world will often judge you before it listens. Sometimes because of where you come from. Sometimes because of how you look. And sometimes because people think they already know your story." Marcus felt his father's hand squeeze his shoulder gently. "When that happens," David continued, "you don't lose your dignity. The people who judge too quickly do." The students listened, really listened. This wasn't a lecture. This wasn't a warning. It was a lesson. One that didn't come from authority alone, but from example. David removed his hand from Marcus's shoulder and took a step back. "My son didn't argue," he said. "He didn't raise his voice. He didn't try to prove himself." David glanced down at Marcus briefly, pride unmistakable in his eyes. "That takes strength." Mrs. Reynolds nodded slowly. "It does," she said. She turned to Marcus. "I'm sorry," she said directly. "You didn't deserve that." Marcus met her eyes. For the first time that day he spoke. "It's okay," he said quietly. And in that moment, the room felt different. Lighter, kinder, wiser. The lesson had been learned, not just by the teacher, but by every student watching. And Marcus realized something he would carry with him for the rest of his life. The truth doesn't need to shout. Sometimes it just needs someone willing to stand beside it. That day changed everything. Not all at once. Not with applause or celebration, but quietly, like a shift in the air that everyone could feel, even if no one talked about it. Marcus was no longer invisible. The next morning, when he walked into class, something felt different. Heads turned, not to laugh, not to whisper, but to acknowledge him. A few students nodded. One boy who had laughed the loudest the day before looked down and muttered a soft, "Hey." No longer underestimated. No longer doubted. Teachers listened when Marcus spoke. Not because of who his father was, but because of how he carried himself. Calm, respectful, confident without arrogance. But the biggest change wasn't in the students. It was in the teacher. Mrs. Reynolds became quieter in the days that followed. More thoughtful. She paused before responding to students, choosing her words with care. When children spoke about their families, she listened, really listened. Within a week, she formally requested diversity and bias awareness training through the district. Not because she was forced to, but because she understood something had to change. She learned how assumptions form, how authority can silence, how one careless moment can stay with a child for years. And one afternoon, after class had ended and the room was empty, Mrs. Reynolds asked Marcus to stay behind. She didn't stand at the front of the room this time. She sat in a student's chair. "I owe you an apology," she said quietly. "A real one." Marcus waited. "I embarrassed you," she continued. "And I judged you based on what I thought I knew. That was wrong." She looked him in the eye. "You didn't deserve that." Marcus nodded slowly. "Thank you," he said. It wasn't forgiveness yet, but it was a beginning. From that day forward, Mrs. Reynolds never again questioned a child's truth based on appearance. When a student spoke, she listened. When someone shared something unusual, she asked questions instead of making judgments. The classroom changed with her. As for Marcus, he didn't brag, didn't boast, didn't say, "I told you so." He didn't walk taller to prove anything. He didn't bring up his father's job again. He simply returned to being who he always was. Quiet, honest, strong. That afternoon, David Johnson was waiting outside the school gates. He stood with his hands in his pockets, watching students spill out in noisy groups, laughing, arguing, living their young lives. When Marcus spotted him, he smiled. Not a big smile, not a proud one, just peaceful. They walked home together, side by side. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows on the sidewalk. Leaves crunched beneath their shoes. "Proud of you," David said gently. Marcus glanced up. "For what?" "For standing in truth," David replied. "Even when it was uncomfortable." Marcus thought about that for a moment. "It didn't feel brave," he admitted. "It just felt hard." David nodded. "That's usually how bravery feels." They walked a little farther in silence. "You know," David said, "the truth doesn't always protect you right away." Marcus looked down at the pavement. "But it always shows up eventually," David continued. "And when it does, it speaks louder than anything you could have said." Marcus smiled. From that day forward, he understood something powerful. You don't need to shout the truth. You don't need to defend it with anger. You don't need to prove yourself to people who refuse to listen. Because one day, the truth will walk into the room all by itself. And when it does, it will stand tall. It will speak calmly. And it will change everything. Sometimes the world doubts you not because you're wrong, but because it isn't ready to believe you. If this story touched your heart, like the video, subscribe, and share it. Because someone out there needs to remember this today.